Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're located. Welcome to today's webinar from ICOR on understanding and protecting against security breaches. Unfortunately, our scheduled presenter, Jim Nelson, has been delayed in China, and Linda Nelson, the ICOR chair, will be filling in for him today. Linda?
Well, thank you, everyone, for attending. Our webinar objectives today include identifying and understanding the different sources for security and data breaches, describing the importance of developing and enforcing strong IT security policies, and really number 3 is kind of the all-encompassing piece, which is really having an understanding of security and data breaches in order to focus on infrastructure protection and the elements of that protection. So let's go ahead and start with our first poll, just to get an idea of who's here. What is your role in cyber and information security?
We have a little over half the folks that have registered on the poll. We'll leave it open for a couple more seconds here. Okay.
It's really interesting that we have mostly people, 73% of the people here not currently responsible but interested, and that's actually not totally surprising, but it is interesting. So today's presentation will be at a higher level. If somebody was fully responsible for this information, my guess is that they would probably know a lot of what we're going to talk about today. It's almost impossible to do a deep dive in a 1-hour webinar. So we hope to share some information with you today that will help you get a really good overview of what we're talking about with cyber and information security. I always like to start with some kind of a cartoon or something to at least get your attention. And in this case, we really want you to understand that what you don't know or see can harm you. And when we're talking about information and cybersecurity, ignorance is not bliss, and it's not really good to remain ignorant. So the more information you can find out, no matter what your role is in the organization, the better equipped that you are. I wanted just to start with the basic definition of what we're talking about with information security. In some organizations, information and cybersecurity are together, and in other organizations, they're siloed. We would hope that it wouldn't be siloed, but that is the case in a lot of aspects. So I just wanted to talk about, just give you a brief example of what we mean by information security, and it's usually tied to 3 things, which is confidentiality, and we're referencing here ISO 27000, which is the definitions or terms database for all the terms having to do with information security. And this is the property that information is not made available or disclosed to unauthorized individuals, entities, or processes. And a lot of what we're going to be talking today about with breaches is going to be dealing with this confidentiality issue. The second piece of this is your integrity with your letter I, which is the property of protecting the accuracy and completeness of the assets. And then the third aspect is the availability, the property of being accessible and usable on demand by an authorized entity. So when we're looking at the cybersecurity aspects, a lot of times they're dealing with the part C in this or the letter C in this with the confidentiality aspects. I'd like to also take a look at what is a data breach. And this is a really great picture kind of summarizing how cyber criminals conduct a data breach. And really a data breach occurs when a cyber criminal successfully infiltrates a data source and extracts sensitive information. You can see that with the number 1 here. This can be done physically by accessing a computer or a network to steal local files, or by bypassing your network security remotely as well. And this latter is often the method used to target companies. They'll go in and try to get in through your network. And cyber criminals usually start with doing some research on your organization. They look for weaknesses in your company's security, whether it's your people, your systems, or your network. Then they launch an attack. And this is where they make the initial contact using either your network or your social network. And a network attack occurs when a cyber criminal uses your infrastructure, system, and application weaknesses to infiltrate your organization's network. Social attacks are usually more about tricking or baiting employees into giving access to the company's network. An employee can be duped into giving his or her login credentials, or maybe fooled into opening a malicious document or an attachment. And I think this is where we all are vulnerable, specifically as employees and as end users. It's happened to our organization. I laughed because one of my daughters works for an insurance company, and they specifically set out spoofs for their employees, and they get rewarded when they don't click on the links because they're just trying to grow awareness. And I'm sure other companies do things that are similar for that. And then once they exfiltrate, once they get into one computer, then that cyber criminal can attack the network and tunnel his or her way into the confidential company data and information. And once the hacker extracts this data, the attack is considered successful. So just as a basic definition of a data breach, Wikipedia says it's the intentional or unintentional release of secure or private confidential information to an untrusted environment. We're going to be referencing several different articles and white papers and research for this presentation, and all of these references will be included in one of the last slides so that you'll have access to those. And just as a reminder, if you have any questions as you go through today, please post the questions using the questions button. And we will also make, in case your question is, will you have the presentation available? Yes, the presentation will be available on our webinar page in a couple of days. And you'll also get a certificate of attendance as well. So there's different types of data breaches. One of those is one of probably the ones we're most familiar with. This is hacking or computer intrusion. You've heard things like phishing. I never knew how to spell phishing with the PH, but this is a different type of phishing than we're maybe used to. Ransomware and malware, as well as skimming. And cyber criminals are getting smarter every day, and they're constantly using a variety of approaches. And so this is where your information and your cybersecurity personnel within your company or your organization are having to work very hard at keeping up with these different types of intrusions. There's also the insider threat. Your employees know the most about where your most sensitive data exists. They know how it's protected in some cases, and they can inflict a significant amount of damage if they're not properly monitored or security protocols are put in place. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. We all know that we're accessing data. We want to be able to access it from our phones, from our laptops. Things are stolen or lost, and data on the move. People can get into your data now, even through all sorts of ways. Just at the airport by leaving things unsecured as well. And then, of course, there's physical theft. That used to be the most common thing, would be actually having your laptop stolen. But it is still a fact of reality. And we see it in movies and different things, but it could be as simple as plugging a USB drive into something that's sensitive on your computer. We also talk about, employee error. We're going to talk more about that as well. But people make mistakes, and sometimes people just do dumb things when it comes to data handling, and we have to account for that as well. Sometimes when your organization is migrating data to a cloud-based application, that actually increases your exposure to an accident of something being shared where it shouldn't. And then, of course, this unauthorized access. This is usually directly attributed to a lack of access controls, and we're going to talk about how you can prevent this through improving your access controls as well. But looking at administrative privileges, not being monitored very well, or not having very good controls with level of privileges as well. So there is a study done, and this is an organization called trendmicro.com. They do a lot of really interesting studies, but this was just as of August 10th. 2018, and you can see that by listing by the different companies here, from Yahoo down to TimeHop, even Uber for some reason is becoming a big source for data breaches. And then you can see the number of records that have been stolen. from 3 billion down to 21 million. Those numbers in my mind are baffling to me. And then they give you the dates of the breaches. So here, this study goes all the way back to 2008, and as more recent as July 2018 with this time hop, which that organization I have not heard of. Just in the last 30 days, things that I saw in the news, Facebook in September, they had a security breach that exposed 50 million users' accounts. Then we had Google Plus was actually shut down in part of the Alphabet organization because of a data breach. And then most recently, looks like I lost the third one somehow. Sorry about that. The most recent one was a court case in California actually not refusing to dismiss a data breach at a healthcare organization. This website here is a really interesting thing. It's called Information is Beautiful, and it gives you a picture of the world's biggest data breaches and hacks. So let me show you what that looks like. And I recommend that you go ahead and take a look at this because it changes every time you load it. So this is accurate as of August 15th, and they do updates, and you can click on these things. So the Equifax one you're probably familiar with, you can click on it. It tells you a little bit about the breach, and then you can go to the report. And they've given you a kind of a code here that they give an interesting story with the ones that are in orange. So, of course, that gets your attention. And they're by year. So down the left, you see 2017 and then 2016, and it goes all the way to 2007. You can also filter by the type of organization as well as the type of link. So this is a really interesting source for you to use to go and find out more information about this. The type of data that is usually stolen is probably not a surprise to you. In this case, they're using member name because a lot of times it has to do with memberships. But we're looking at date of birth, of course, your social security number, if you have some kind of a member identification number, an email address, your physical mailing address. I'm not even sure what they do with that in this case anymore, but I'm sure it helps to validate your identity. Telephone numbers, bank account numbers. And then they're using words like clinical information and claims information because, surprisingly, healthcare organizations, hospitals and whatnot, as well as insurance companies, are becoming a prime target to get this information. So the next poll is, has your organization experienced a data and or security breach in the past 5 years?
Okay, we've gotten to the halfway point with people registering their responses. We'll leave it open for a few more seconds here. Okay, we're going to close the poll here.
Well, this is about as evenly distributed as you can get with a poll. There is 38% voting saying no, but with 31% being not sure, you wonder how that might impact our the data itself just from this small sampling. And I would expect, so one of the things that I saw when I was taking a look at this that was surprising to me was that companies that have experienced a data breach in the last 5 years, a significant one, could expect not to be breached in the next 5 years. That, for me, that those dates kind of confused me. But what they were seeing was that really no one is safe. But I would imagine that there's a lot of variables with why you might not get hacked as much, be as vulnerable as some other organizations that hadn't been hacked. But my guess is it's because as a result of being breached that you've put together some things that close those vulnerabilities. So I would just, really say that this data is really important. And if you haven't been hacked, it's not about if, it's about when. And you probably are going to experience it more. You might have a higher vulnerability of being hacked in the future if you haven't in the past. There's also, I'm sure you've been familiar with the Ponemon studies, and in this year, IBM, the Ponemon puts out lots of studies every year, and usually it has to do with the year before. So in this case, IBM Security did a benchmarking along with that. So you can find the Ponemon study in a variety of places, but also through the IBM site. And they looked at the cost of data breaches in 2018. This is their 2018 report reflecting 2017. And you can go to their site and you can look at it globally, you can look at it by country, and there's all sorts of, you can also look at different cost factors. So it's a really interesting way for you to do some review of that as well. I'm just going to go over some of the executive summary of that. And what they really found is that the average total cost of a data breach is about $3.86 million, and this is by per organization, by the way. So just looking at these numbers, it's not globally. This is the average cost per organization. And this average one-year cost, it's a 6.4% increase over the year before. The average cost per lost or stolen record is $148. So we're going to look again, but if you remember what I looked at just a few minutes ago, the number of records stolen are in the millions and billions. So that's where you get to the cost per data breach. And this is also an increase in cost of 4.8%. And then the likelihood of recurring material breach over the next 2 years is about a 27.9% increase. And the average cost savings when you have an incident response team is about $14 per record. So one of the things that they were trying to share here with the Ponemon study is that you can reduce the impact to your organization by being prepared. And I think probably everybody on the call here understands that. And one of the things that they did with this study was that they interviewed more than 2,200 IT data protection and compliance professionals from 477 different companies that experienced a data breach. So this was, obviously, they were interviewing companies that had experienced the breach. And the main thing is that what you're seeing here with these trends is that they continue to be costlier and result in more consumer records being lost or stolen year after year. They also did, they changed their study a bit this past year, and they looked at 2 new cost factors. One was security automation as a way to protect yourself, and the other one was the extensive use of the Internet of Things devices. So here is where we're seeing so many different devices and the need to protect your organization from your users using all sorts of different devices. And they also have come up with a new term called a mega breach, when you have more than 1 million compromised records. And it is sort of sad that we have to come up with new terms to describe really the vast impact that cyber criminals are having. So when we're looking at some of the data, they just broke this data down into what we're comparing from the year to year, and some of this is already summarized. So that $148 per sample versus $141 from last year. The United States, Canada, and Germany continue to have the highest cost per capita, which is really interesting, from $233 to $202 to $188, respectively, and that Turkey, India, and Brazil have a much lower cost. And I don't have the answer for why that is. It wasn't provided. It was the information was just shared. Note again that our total cost is going up from 3.62 last year to 3.86 million this year. And again, since the United States and had the highest per capita costs, they also said that the highest average cost was in the U.S., followed by the Middle East. And India and Brazil had the lowest average cost, respectively, as well. When we're looking at some root causes, they tend to remain the same. When we're looking at human error, it's still about 25%. We've seen that number go between 24 and 30% over the past few years at a cost of about $128 million. And then we have system glitches. This, again, is something that we've seen remain pretty consistent over the years. And then we're looking at the malicious or criminal attack being almost half of the data breaches. But if you're looking at the two, our own internal systems do result in more than half of the data breaches. And so when you're looking at what you're spending on protecting your organization, you might want to also look at how you're spending that and how it relates to the statistics showing of the difference between the human error and the system glitch being just over 50%, and the malicious and criminal attack. How are your resources being spent when you compare it to the type of breach that we're seeing? The other aspect is the time to identify, and the cost to the organization is based on how long it takes you, because the longer you take to identify it, the longer it's going to take, or the more cost it's going to be to your organization. So when we're talking about MTTI, that stands for the mean time to identify, and then the mean time to contain is the MTTC. And the MTTI metric helps organizations to understand the time it takes to detect that an incident has occurred, and the MTTC metric measures the time it takes for a responder to resolve a situation and then ultimately restore the device. As shown in this figure, we're seeing that it's also taking longer for us to identify as well as to respond, and that's with being more prepared. And that's tied to the fact that recent attacks are more, I don't know how to use the word, but there's more stealth to that, how they're doing that, and they're becoming more creative. Our cyber criminals are getting better at what they do, I guess, is the upshot of this. There's an also really great study done, and it's called Debunking the Myths, done by Trend Micro. And they're looking at myth number 1, that hacking and malware are the leading causes of data breaches. And although the news is rife with stories on how certain malware or hacking groups are responsible, the truth is most of them are actually caused by device loss, which I thought was really interesting. So overall, it accounts for 41% of all breaches compared to the 25% caused by hacking and malware. Companies often overlook the type of sensitive information stored on their employees' laptops, their mobile devices, and even thumb drives. And if any of these devices get lost, stolen, or left unprotected, they become an easy way to steal data. But of course, that doesn't mean that hacking and malware are not serious. These kinds of threats should never be taken lightly. And compared to device loss or theft, which can be really mitigated through a remote device wipe, the use of virtual infrastructure and enforcement of stricter policies like hacking and attacks using malware are more planned and deliberate. So having some highly customized defense solution and strategies are required in these cases. And one of the nice things about this study is that when you go on to see the study, it's very interactive. So you can click on these and be able to view some of what they're showing as well. So give me a second, because it looks like it's not pulling up. So give me 1 minute to do this. So if you click on any of these, that'll give you looks like it has to relaunch each time you click on it. So let me just see if I can get that launched. Otherwise, we'll go back. But this is the actual study that's done. This was done in 2015. And so I'm just going to share with you, it's interesting to go and take a look at the study because it's very interactive, and I'm not going to click on this for each one of the myths, but I just wanted to give you an idea that by looking at these, we can do that. And I'm not sure why it's taking so long to load, so I'm going to go ahead and go back to the presentation. But when you look at the different elements here, you can click on those, and they will go ahead and provide you with that information. They're also looking at the type of attacks that are being done. So myth number 2 says that attackers go for personally identifiable information. So you've heard of the acronym PII, to reap the most data. And this is both true and false. Although, your personally identifiable information is the most popular stolen record type, it doesn't actually guarantee an attacker has more access to the target information. So it really depends on the situation and the attacker's goal. If the aim is to get educational or health records, having a person's PII will give the attacker a higher chance of accessing those bits of information. If attackers really want to gain access to the proverbial keys to the kingdom, they're going to go for credentials, or more specifically, the credentials of your network administrator. Myth number 3 states that using hacking or malware is the best way to steal all types of data. So looking at the probability, this one is actually true, only because these were the most popular methods that attackers used in the past decade. So hacking into a network, whether using brutal force, social engineering, or malware, has the highest chance of returns. The second most preferred method is through insiders, and we're going to again talk about those, both, the unsuspecting ones as well as the disgruntled employees who leak data on their own violation. The fourth myth is the retail industry is the most affected by data breaches. And although retailers have suffered many losses because of data breaches, the most effective industry was actually the healthcare sector, as I mentioned before. They account for more than a fourth, or 26.9% in the past decade. The second, this was one that really surprised me, was the education sector. And this was followed by the government agencies, and then retailers actually come in fourth place with 12.5%. I was really shocked at the education sector being number 2. So although its share is not as big as the healthcare industry, the effects of a breach for a high-profile retail giant, though, can still be damaging in terms of reputation and revenue. And then the last myth is that PII is the most in-demand underground commodity in terms of breached information. And what was really interesting, if you go to their study, is they have 20 different pages of different types of actually data showing that what's the data going for? So when you're looking at, I just showed this one because it had to do with PayPal, your eBay accounts, and then credit cards with the CV numbers. And this is what it's selling for. And this is really amazing to me, that at this time, there's such a surplus of that personal information being available in the criminal underground that it's caused the price to drop. So just like supply and demand with other industries, the cyber criminals are also facing a problem, is that they're stealing the data and it's not worth as much as it used to be, which means there's so much data being stolen that there's a dearth in the marketplace, which is crazy to me. And it's down from $4 to $1 per piece of data. As I don't know what the exact terminology is there. But this also goes for credit card numbers, because they're now being sold in bulk regardless of your card brand. And interestingly, the stolen Uber accounts are the one that's gaining in popularity, so that price is actually going up. It's a crazy world when you start looking at the cost of things like this and what people are making selling your data. I wanted to just briefly mention the fact that there are new requirements. And while the General Data Protection Regulation Act from the European Union has gone into effect and all of Europe needs to comply, the fact is that I don't know how many businesses or organizations are only doing business in the United States or outside of the European Union. This is something that I think every organization needs to be very cognizant of and looking at how they need to be compliant with this. And there are fines, and it is going to be based on the percentage of your global revenue. So this is something I think all organizations should take a look at. I also wanted to bring up that there is an international standard on information security, and a lot of organizations are trying to mitigate some of their vulnerabilities by either following these controls and using these controls to help reduce their risk, as well as getting their company certified to the standard to help make sure that it's embedded in what their organization is doing. So essentially, when we're looking at controls, we're looking at administrative controls, things like employee screening, security awareness training, non-disclosure agreements, and different administrative policies. We're also looking at technical controls and things like two-factor authentication, password protection and encryption, And then physical controls, looking at your gates, guards, and guns, your building security, and your key card access. And all of this is tied to your data center, and with so many more organizations also using the cloud, this does impact how this information is getting to the data center, wherever that data center is, because we all know that the cloud is not actually storing our information. It is being stored in someone's data center. So the itsecurity.com did a study that looked at compromising behaviors. And one of those was this refusal to upgrade to newer software. And I know we all hate having to do these upgrades, and we put them off as long as we can. But this is actually something that really makes us vulnerable, because the reason software is upgraded is to try to reduce the vulnerabilities of people being able to get in through the software. Vulnerabilities are commonly exploited for lots of reasons. And the second reason is poor to non-existent spam filtering. And here's where we get in the challenge of, is you're filtering your spam and then you're not actually getting the emails that you want. So it's that balance of trying to make sure that your email systems are secure, but you're still receiving emails. And this is it's a really frustrating balance, because spam is again, these criminals are becoming more and more creative and becoming trying to figure out ways to get past the spam. And so if you're not keeping your spam software up to date as well, that also creates a compromised system. And I know every one of us has opened an unsafe email attachment. I, number one, have done that. And it is a painful thing to learn from, is to not do that. But again, the spammers are getting more and more creative. We also have employees taking company data home. And you know what? I don't see how employers can expect people to work from home and expect them to work 7 days a week and more than 8 hours a day without taking the company data home. So that is something that has to be looked at from the organization. That's why you need to have policies and procedures, which we're going to talk about. Every organization has to have a policy regarding confidential information and data. But if you're going to be working remotely, you're going to have data that could be compromised. We've talked about loss of the data storage devices, actually just losing the devices themselves where the data is. Losses of your controlled access badges, so people can take your badges and get into the company, during off hours, for example, as well as unfettered personal web browsing. We see more and more even companies having problems. We've had people say to us, well, we can't attend your GoToWebinar because we're not allowed to access that at work. So people have to go and wait till they get home. And that's why we do post our webinars online so people can view later, because we're seeing that more and more, that people can't even view webinars using WebEx or GoToWebinar at work. And then, of course, for physical security for the equipment themselves, where equipment is stolen. So let's take and start our next poll, which has to do with how vulnerable do you feel your organization is to an information and or cybersecurity breach?
Okay, the votes are coming in. We've got about half the people on the line have registered. We'll keep it open for a few more seconds here. All right, go ahead and close the poll.
Well, I think you're all very practical in saying that you feel somewhat vulnerable. Again, a lot of people aren't sure. It is interesting that nobody felt very vulnerable, and I think that has something to do with the fact that all of us at every organization have something, you have some kind of security. Even if you buy a laptop and you don't work for anybody and you work for yourself, there's security that you can put on your own devices. So I think that this idea that we're all somewhat vulnerable is realistic, meaning that we do what we can. We're trying to be prepared, but we never know until it happens to us. So we're going to move now into protecting. We've kind of been talking about the what can happen to you. We'll talk next a little bit about how you might protect, how are you going to protect your information. So just understanding that all sensitive information must be protected wherever it's stored, sent, or used. And it's really, try not to reveal your personal information inadvertently. And I know that that's something we're all very aware of. When you're trying to reduce the transfer of data, the organization should ban shifting data from one device to another external device, and losing removable data will put that data on the disk, of course, under risk as well. Some organizations are restricting downloads, so any media that may serve as an allegiance to the can serve as an allegiance to the hackers, and therefore there should be some restrictions to anything that you download. So this could reduce the risk of transferring the downloadable media to an external source. Also, looking at shredding files, you should shred all the files and folders before disposing storage equipment. So you get new laptops. You need to make sure that you don't, even if you're recycling your laptop at a recycling place, you need to make sure that you've shredded the files on that, because there's people that can retrieve that information if you haven't done that. You should also have a ban on unencrypted devices. So laptops and other portable devices that are unencrypted are really prone to attack. When you are doing a secure, when you're using secure courier services or tamper-proof packaging while you're transporting bulk data, should also help in preventing a breach. And of course, good passwords. Here, I don't know, maybe just because I'm older than 40, I might even be older than 50. Trying to remember good passwords is a challenge. And then, of course, when you have a really good password, not putting it down where somebody can just find it and read it. So there's that balance, again, of having a good enough password that you can remember so you're not stuck actually being able to access. And I know that some of us get irritated when we're told we have to change our password and we can't use a previous password. And coming up with a new password is a challenge. One of the things that are really recommended is that you automate your security. You're not relying on somebody running it at certain different times. So when you have that, they can regularly check password settings, they can check your server and firewall configurations, and this helps to reduce the risk of losing sensitive information as well. Your security team needs to be always very vigilant in identifying suspicious network activity and should be prepared to respond if there's an attack to the network. And we talked about the speed of response, of course, makes the attack minimized versus taking longer. There should be a way that your security people are periodically checking security controls in order to have control over that network, and regularly checking on internet contents to load to identify if any breaches have occurred as well. Your security team should be tracking data, so tracking the motion of data within your organization, so that'll help prevent any unintentional use of sensitive information. Defining your accessibility to those who are working on the company's sensitive data will also bring down the risk of malicious users, who can have access to what. We always talk about the importance of training. Everybody in your organization needs to have some kind of security training, and of course, the more access you have, the more training that you need. Shutting down the different avenues to the organization's warehouse will help prevent incursions by the hacker as well. So you have management, production, and security solutions really should be combined to prevent those targeted attacks. And of course, you need to have some kind of a breach response plan. This will help you with the triggering a quick response to your data breaches and the help in the reduction of harm. And whatever you call that, it could be your cyber response plan, whatever you're calling that doesn't really matter, as long as it contains steps involving the notification of the correct people or the agency or the organization that's supposed to be part of that response. So just as an end user, we wanted to make this as practical as possible for you as well. If something happens to your accounts, notify your bank if it's a bank account. We know that end users are almost never the target of cyber criminals when they're out to steal sensitive information in bulk. However, we all know that we can be affected. And we've all had our credit cards stolen. We've had our credit cards hacked. We've had your banks, your access to your bank accounts are hacked, and they're pretty sneaky. They take out minimum amount of money to see if you're noticing, and then they go for the larger amounts. So of course you should notify your bank immediately. Double check your email addresses from the incoming. This is where you often see, you're getting an email from American Express or from your bank or from, somebody that you think but the name is correct, but the URL behind the @ sign is not actually from that organization. So this is kind of a spoofing thing that's done as well. Don't click on anything that's a link in your email unless you know who it's coming from. And of course, if your credentials or financials have been tampered with, you need to let the company know that they have been hacked so that they can help you enroll in that fraud victim assistance program. And I'm sure that this is something that you're doing as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about having a security policy. My guess is that every one of your organizations has a security policy. I would be really surprised if you don't. But this is where you document the philosophy, strategy, policies, and practices with regards to the main thing. Remember, we talked at the beginning of this presentation about confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So we just need to make sure that all three of those things are covered in your policy. Some of the goals of your security policy is to protect your information proactively. So in order for your policy to be effective, it needs to be customized to the business and to your environment. There's not going to be one standard security policy that's going to meet every organization's needs, but most of them have these common themes or goals. The first one, of course, is to protect your information. And your information should be considered an asset or property of the organization, and you're trying to protect that from unauthorized access, modification, disclosure, or destruction. A second goal is to provide the guidance and ability to respond to any threat or incident that occurs within your organization fast and effectively. Remember that threats and incidents can include many different vectors, such as digital or natural disaster. So it's not always about the cyber criminal, but a good incident response plan can provide direction on how to contain, prevent escalation, as well as mitigate the damage, with the intention being the result of a lower cost of repair and recovery. You also need to have technical controls in place in order to comply with current compliance requirements. And we talked about the GDPR just a minute ago. And I'm assuming that you also have other things that you need to be compliant with, depending on what industry that you're in. They all have different legal and regulatory requirements. So as we also mentioned, many businesses leverage information security standards, whether it's NIST or ISO 27000 or other guidance documents. And then you need to make sure that the people that are responsible for this know what their roles and responsibilities are so that they can make sure that those are working and that you know how to train those people as well. What you're really looking for is an alignment between your business goals and objectives with your policies and procedures so that that will influence the business behavior. It's really important because business goals and objectives are going to drive those policies and procedures, which are then going to drive the business behavior. Most times what you're going to see is inefficiencies when parts of the organization are operating in a silo, and I mentioned that earlier. We're talking about cybersecurity practices versus information security practices versus your information technology, disaster recovery practices versus your business continuity practices. And then you might have things going on in your risk management silos as well. So just really, really looking at making sure that whatever you're doing is as unsiloed as possible. And it's really this information security and cybersecurity is an enabling process for secure business operations. And if you don't have that process aligned, you're not going to be very effective. And then you're going to have gaps in what you're doing and you're going to be vulnerable. So to help you with that understanding, you need to know where your information is stored. This is something I have seen when teaching classes on business continuity and information technology disaster recovery is, you're backing up your data and you're restoring it, but which data, where is the data? and this misunderstanding of everything's being backed up, but they don't know where it is. So they have to back up and restore everything. And so it's really, really important that you not only understand what you need and when, but you need to know where your confidential data is. You can't make sure that the data doesn't leave the organization inappropriately if you don't know where it's stored. So you can't protect it if you don't know where it is. And this, so again, this is all part of protecting the information itself. So there's some key functional requirements about this. You need to discover where your confidential information is. So where is it stored? You need to create an inventory of the sensitive data, and then you're going to need to make sure that you're managing data cleanup over time so that it's kept clean and it isn't filled with things that you don't need. You also need to monitor how it's used. So how is this data being used? What's the content and context of this data? And then gain visibility into your policy violations as well. Who's following your policy and who's not? And what are the ramifications for not following policy? Next, we're talking about preventing. So here, you really can't prevent loss of confidential data, again, if you don't know where it is and you don't know how, and you're not monitoring it. So the best way to protect it is to have an understanding of this information, and then you need to start securing that data and then enforcing those data protection policies. And all this really leads into managing this. Having a defined unified policy across the organization, being able to remediate and report on incidents so you have a clear understanding of what's happening, and this all helps you then to detect that content accurately. This is another picture of having a comprehensive threat coverage. So it's really critical for any information protection solution that you decide to use to provide comprehensive coverage of a number of data formats as well as communication protocols. We kind of say if you can't scan it, you can't discover it, or you can't block it. So first, when it comes to scanning data at rest on storage, you need to find sensitive information. And so the storage solution should be able to scan a variety of file systems on a number of platforms, a variety of document management repositories like SharePoint, Documentum, LiveLink. You should be able to scan top messaging platforms like Microsoft Exchange, Lotus Domino, and various data platforms like Microsoft SQL, Oracle, and so on. It should even be able to scan several web server platforms. When you're looking at the next, you need to be looking at the solution that should be able to scan the endpoint's local file servers. And you're looking at improperly stored information, in order to control the loss of sensitive information while connected to untrusted networks. And we're all in hotels, we all travel, you're in airports. Those networks can be very untrusted. And then prevent the printing or faxing of sensitive information, blocking or copying of sensitive information to a USB, CDs, DVDs, or any other type of removable storage media. And I've seen lots of policies at companies that, the laptops themselves don't even have a way for you to connect with a removable storage media. And then when it comes to restricting the flow of information out of a network, the solution should be able to monitor email, web traffic, instant messaging, and any FTP traffic, and just making sure that your detection engine can also analyze both the content and context at an enterprise level. So looking at accurate detection, you need to be looking at your content from a structured viewpoint as well as an unstructured viewpoint, and then as a described. So looking at, where is your content? And then what is the context? Looking at the people, your departments, your partners, your contractors, where are they located? What countries, what departments, what branch? And we were earlier, when I had shown you a couple of those studies, you can literally look at the risk by country. And some countries, I think South Africa was one of the ones that was most at risk. And I think Germany was the least at risk. So you have, depending on where your company is located and where your different parts of your organization are located, they're going to be vulnerable based on what country they're in and what region that they're in. Also, what they're doing, so the location of these different departments and branch offices and what they're doing there, the languages also have an impact, as well as the container itself, the document type, the network protocol and how it's encrypted. You also need to look at the scale of volume. You've got billions of records, you've got millions of documents. What are your latencies? How many gigabytes do you have? And then looking at your storage. How much can be scanned? And that the amount of storage that you're looking at, and what are your backup queues? We see organizations using samplings versus failing over completely because of the cost. So it's going to be really hard to detect a single violation. It's pretty easy to do that in a lab setting, but it's much harder to do that when you're looking at the actual scale of what most organizations are looking at. So there's really, we've been talking about cyber criminals. There's really three main breach sources. And so you have to have a really good understanding of those types of sources in order to start looking at different mitigation strategies. So we've looked at cyber criminals. And, cyber criminals are really organized. They can be independent hackers. And this is a really common term used in the cybersecurity industry. But we talked about the fact that we have insiders that make mistakes or can be malicious. And that is actually we talked about that being 52% of the breach sources. So well-meaning insiders are usually those people that have legitimate access to your network, but they're either careless or they're not thinking, and they expose a company to risk. And this is really heavily represented by employees who inadvertently violate data security policies. And oftentimes this includes business partners. So we're really looking at people internal, but we're forgetting about all the people that actually work for us as partners that can help increase our vulnerability. And then the sad thing is we all have malicious insiders. Not everybody gets to keep their job. We fire people. We have unhappy employees that don't leave. We have people that serve as industrial spies. And so we really need to make sure that you're considering all of those, the unhappy, the industrial spies, as well as the ex-employees, as malicious insiders. And there's actually a growing segment of this because not only are they costing the organization more money, but they're selling their information to cyber criminals. So it becomes a really big issue when you have those two things working against you. So let's look next at how hackers gather information. And we're just going to talk very briefly about this. They're looking at social engineering, so they're impersonating someone else. They're dumpster diving. They're persuading you to click on things. Then we have insider knowledge, those insiders that we talked about, the malicious people. And they know about your processes and procedures. They know your personnel schedules. They understand your internal politics and relationships. We have social networks. We talked about, some organizations are really limiting your ability to do that, and where your employees are sharing their personal details, and they get trust built between their, quote, friends, and they can be emotionally manipulated to share information as well. Data mining, there's people that's their whole job is to go out and data mine, as well as this. We've talked about the espionage aspects as well. So these are the primary ways they gather information. But the sad thing is that well-meaning insiders, when you're looking at the actual data, they say that 1 in 400 emails contain confidential information, that 1 in 50 network files are wrongly exposed. And we've talked a lot about this, that 67% happen because of well-meaning. When you're looking at this type, it's not done intentionally, it's done accidentally. When you're looking at malicious insiders, when they've done studies that 59% of ex-employees openly admit to stealing data. Those are the ones that openly admit to it. So imagine what that data is. And this statistic here from this other study actually ties very closely to what we saw at the beginning, which is about 26% of those security breaches are from malicious. And so it's costly. And so how are you going to manage that? Some of the reasons I just wanted to mention here for malicious insiders has to do with they're getting ready for their next job, so they're stealing data to use. You see that a lot with salespeople. Well, I need my customer list. I'm taking it with me. These are my customers. So you need to have really strong contracts with your employees. Stealing intellectual property to sell. and then destroying or damaging data before they leave. It's a big deal. So we're going to just really talk at a high level about some ways that you can, some of the ways that have been put in place to mitigate some of this. So you've got messaging security strategies, which looks at things like malware scanning, content filtering, anti-spam, doing a reputational analysis, the whole blacklisting, graylisting, traffic shaping, also called packet shaping. This is something I hadn't heard of, as well as encryption, which is, I think most people are familiar with that as well. Endpoint protection strategies include things like file system scanning, memory scanning, putting in firewalls, network intrusion protection, host intrusion protection, and data loss protection. Those of us that don't work in the information and cybersecurity world, at least having an understanding of what these strategies are so that we can ask the right questions is really important. Then we're looking at protecting critical systems and doing things like server hardening. We talked about the fact that that's what the cyber criminals are trying to do, is to get into your servers. They're trying to get into your network. They're trying to get into the system itself so you need to be able to monitor those file keys, block devices, block unused ports, limit connectivity as much as you can, and really restrict behaviors. So being able to monitor and identify behaviors that you don't want to see happening. We've all heard about virtualization. Virtualization actually helps protect your data as well. So you've got platform protection, infrastructure protection, your guest VMware protection, content protection, your availability, as well as management protection. And we could do hours on each one of these. So these are things that your people that deal with information and cybersecurity should know a lot about. We also now have to have cloud protection strategies because we're all using the cloud. So that ties to social media, file sharing, cloud-based messaging, how to protect your data when you're transmitting it, managing the different services that you have, as well as the cloud visibility and protection. And then looking at the security platform integration. You have to collect, store, correlate, and report. There should be a whole system of things tying all of these things together. They need to be integrated, which we continue to talk about silos. Each one of these systems themselves need to be integrated. So make sure whatever solutions that you're putting in place or strategies that you're putting in place meet those requirements. And then you should be logging your data, and making sure that you understand, and putting together what are your requirements, what are the different sources, and where you're going to be storing those things. So making sure that you've got a log management process in place is also really important. So I just wanted to finish up with our final poll. And so for which type of data breach do you feel the most prepared? We're going to take it from the opposite side. Instead of talking about where you're vulnerable, where are you the most prepared?
Okay, the votes are, the tallies are starting to come in. We've got about half the folks have registered their response. We'll keep it open for a couple more seconds here, Linda, and I think I'm going to close it.
So this is kind of what I thought, and that's why I started with the presentation with the amount of money that we're spending. Does it correlate with where the actual breaches are coming from? So we talked about the fact that well-meaning insiders and malicious insiders actually make up more data breaches than the cyber criminals. So it's interesting that we see that 55% of companies are actually feeling pretty good about how they're managing their cyber criminals. And so maybe that gives us something to have a conversation about, especially if you're in the business continuity space, is in the risk management space, which is how are we managing our malicious insiders? Because that seemed to be, in this case, is where you feel the least prepared. So just to summarize, regardless of the type of the organization, all organizations need to have information and/or cybersecurity policies and procedures. And it's really important to understand the types and sources of those different data breaches and help to prevent those. And we really see legal and regulatory requirements driving implementation along with the cost of those breaches. You can't ignore the cost. You can learn more. Most of this content was taken from several of our different courses. We have our Critical Environments Technology Professional, and one of the modules in there has to do with information security. Our Critical Environments Manager talks about information security from the facilities aspect in your data center. And coming in January of 2019 will be a 2-day or e-learning course on understanding and protecting against security breaches. Like I promised, we have all the references listed here, and this will be shared so that you can go ahead and read each of these things in more detail. And we just want to invite you to our last 2 webinars of the year, developing a different resilient workforce, something completely different from today's topic. And then in December, we'll be looking at reputation management. We thank you each for attending, and we'll end for today. Thank you.